Hello, 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 and welcome to yet another episode of PitchZone. It's the last PitchZone of the year, and I welcome everybody who has joined us live on YouTube. And today's episode is all about storytelling and narrative in business. I'm really looking forward to our guest today, Chris Hare. But before we bring him in, let me greet Nathan Gold as my
Hello.
co-host. Nathan, how
Hello.
are you?
Hello. Doing well, thank you. Good to be back. Last one of the year. How many did we
All
do this
right.
year? I lost track.
This is exactly number 50 this year. So we did one every
Wow.
week with the exception of Thanksgiving last month. And
Right.
then next week we'll take a little break as well because you see the snow in the background here. So by next week we are probably totally snowed in, and I figured, well, let's just not do that to ourselves.
In Thailand?
I'm not sure. That's always my big question. Where are we right now? You're in San Francisco. I'm here. What weather rules? What time rules? I don't know. But in Storyland, all of these things really don't make such a big difference. And when it comes to stories, there's one person that I really, really enjoy talking about the topic, and that is Chris Hare. Chris, welcome to Pitch Zone. How are you today?
Good. Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm excited.
Oh, it's absolutely wonderful. Chris, you are a storyteller. In your words, what is a storyteller?
So I had a conversation earlier this week with someone who's in a similar line of work, and they said I disagree with your basic premise, and they said most people are not storytellers, and I completely disagree. Stories are how we make meaning of life. If you go to a bar with your friends, go out for coffee, everyone tells stories, right? Doesn't mean we're all amazing storytellers, but it means that's how we get through life, is telling stories, right? So if you look at my background, if you look at my whatever shoulder that is, my logo in the background, if you look at these sound panels over here, the books that are in the background, my jacket, my hair, there's a story that I can tell you about every single one of those, right? It might not be a story that drives some massive result, but those stories build connection and help us make meaning. And so in terms of what I do, though, it's really my goal is to help leaders create a future where they reach the finish line and they're proud of what they've accomplished. And business gets that effectiveness part right a lot, but also how they accomplished it, who they took with them, who they became in the process. And the ways that you get there is a narrative framework. And then the stories that we tell are the fuel that get us there.
Absolutely. And I love how you already started to frame our episode here. And this is one of the things that I noticed from the first moment on, that you are really walking the talk. I mean, everything about you is a narrative, and your name definitely helps you here as one of the key characters of your narrative. We'll get to that in just a second. In the meantime, or first, I want to say hello to everybody who joined us here online today. We have Ibrahim. Hello, Ibrahim. I hope you didn't have to wait too long and you are still here with us. We have Yash from India. Yash, it's always great to see your name here. I hope you're doing well in India. And then we have Scott Peak from Colorado. We have a couple other viewers right now. If you want to say hello in the chat, please do so while we continue the discussion. So, Hare, rabbit. You are weaving all of this into your own story, into your own narrative. When did you start to develop this innate skill, or refine that skill that we all have, that storytelling skill? And what made you say, hey, I've got something that I want to share with the world?
Yeah, so I think it is really all about inputs and outputs. And so the inputs for me as a kid were lots of stories, books. Lived a lot in my head, creating stories in my head, stories that my dad would tell, stories we would tell as a family. Those were fuel in the inputs. But I think where the seeds of it, and you could probably go back further, but in 2010, 2011, or early 2010s, I was working on a project for Microsoft for a developer audience, knew nothing about the audience. We were creating content to help them market their apps. And so I just said, I'm just going to go talk to the audience and create the content with them, right? So found the developers who created one of the most successful apps in the Microsoft App Store. We won't talk about how poorly Microsoft was performing next to Apple, but went and talked to them and created the content with them. And what was interesting is the client ended up taking the project away, giving it to an offshore agency, never saw it again. And fast forward, so that was, say, 2012, fast forward to 2015 when I'm at Microsoft. I'm in a meeting and someone says, is this Chris Hare who created that developer ebook? That was the most successful piece of developer content I've ever used here at Microsoft, right? And so that was the beginning of it. It wasn't a big aha, but it was just, that's what I've always done. And so when I went to Amazon, I built the entrepreneur storytelling program for Amazon Marketplace. And it was, ultimately what I came to believe is we as a brand don't have the answers. Agencies don't have the answers. The people who have the answers are our customers, our employees, our partners, et cetera. And we have part of the answer, right? But it's going and talking to people and asking the right questions and letting them tell their stories. And then the shift in the narrative was over, I did my first strategic narrative engagement in 2020 and saw how it was actually transforming a company and moving from this content that I was helping brands create and kind of launch through all of these pipelines out into the world to how do we utilize the stories within a business to build a narrative that shifts the future. And then the last piece is over the last year with my podcast, discovering that there's this really amazing confluence of effectiveness and human-centered values and the power of narrative and then also stories to shift that.
So, Chris, as you work with these companies, helping them build their narrative, could you share with us one of the most challenging narrative issues you've ever solved, and how did you approach it?
Yeah, so I mean, they're all scary and seem impossible when you start. So I'll tell you a very challenging one, and also my favorite project that I've worked on was with a mid-market paint distributor. They'd been totally disrupted by e-commerce. So it went from this 60-year-old company, went from a linear supply chain to we get the brushes and the caulk and the paint and then hand it off to the retailers, to all of a sudden now the manufacturers are trying to manage distribution or manage 100 different marketplaces. The client is going through digital transformation to service them, and they've opened their own e-commerce, which is now freaking out their retailers who are calling them 15 hours a week and screaming at them, right? Because you're going to put us out of business, right? So what was fascinating there, and generally what you see is narrative is often seen as a tagline or some warm and fuzzy. The reality is there's always going to be conflict in an ecosystem or in an environment. And so it's really about going, in terms of process, going and finding out what each of your audiences wants, where that conflict exists, and then creating what I call a future center of gravity. What's that differentiated future that only you as a brand can create with each of your audiences, where they each have an opportunity to win. It doesn't mean they will win, but where they each have an opportunity to win. And the thing I would add is narrative is I think narrative gets harder in two ways. One, the bigger the company gets, it gets a lot harder. So when you're doing it for an Amazon or a Microsoft, their top level, narrative or messaging flies at 100,000 feet, right? So it's very hard to make that relevant. The other place where it gets hard is where there is a lack of human-centered values. And
what the magic in my mind of what values do for you, positive values, they constrain you, right? So with this distributor, for them, integrity was one of their values. No one wants to hear that you have integrity. Like, hopefully everyone has integrity, right? But you can demonstrate that, right? So for them, they had a principle that they called pricing integrity, which is we will never underprice or even charge the same, I believe, as the retailer, because we want to honor their place within the ecosystem. So those values constrain you, and which then forces you to have to innovate or build partnerships. So in their case, they built a partnership with a competitor, which is very compelling from a narrative standpoint. And so to land the plane, for me, there were two things that were really compelling. The first one was more fun, was when they took it to Sherwin-Williams, biggest brand on the planet, and they said, this is the most aggressive narrative we've ever heard in this space. It's like we're getting punched in the face and we love it. So that was cool, but that's not business. Those aren't business results. But what was amazing is one day I just stopped in unannounced, and their COO was walking down the hall, and he said, Chris, I have to tell you, we're using the narrative. If you walk around to everyone's desk, they have the cheat sheet there. They're learning it. We used it in our meeting this morning. If you go to the warehouses across the country, our warehouse workers are learning it, right? My son actually worked there this summer. It was his first real job. And I kept asking him, have you learned the narrative yet? And he's like, what are you talking about? And I'm like, oh, man, got some work to do. But yeah, so that's probably one of the more, they're all challenging, but they're all fun as well.
That's really powerful. And I want to keep on this train of thought there while you take a sip of whatever you're drinking there. What I'm real curious now is once the new story is ready and it's been fleshed out and validated with the right people in the company, what's your secret to socializing that story within the company? Outside the company, I don't care about that, because you got marketing departments that can create all that outbound stuff. But what about the inside? Can you tell us how do you get everyone on the same page so that when they're at a dinner table and they say, so what does your company do? They reflect that narrative everywhere in the world that they are asked.
Yeah, and I don't want to be annoying or pedantic. What I'm going to tease apart just a little bit the stories. So when I talk about inputs, outputs, the stories are the atomic stories, which we can get to, and defining those are the input, and then the narrative is the framework. The reason I'm making that distinction is those two narrative and story often get blended together, and so we can come back to that. I think what this company did particularly well, and I will say a lot, the really big companies, you build something and, at a Microsoft, for example, you may never know how that's impacted. You may hear back anecdotally, right? You see companies like Gong actually did a study where they showed they used AI to measure sellers when they used the narrative versus when they didn't, and the impact that it had, right? I think going back to the distributor, the paint distributor, what they wisely did was, I don't think it's wise to go out and have a big celebration and an all hands and tell everyone this is our narrative, because you are going to have friction, and not just friction. You'll likely have people, entrenched people who potentially even try and sabotage what you're doing. I think what they wisely did is we accounted for all of the audiences, the employees, the partners, the retailers, etc. But in that instance, they didn't go right to the retailers and have that conversation with them. That was a very emotionally charged conversation, right? What they did is they just roadshowed it and just went and met with one supplier and then another one, and took the learnings from that. And you can learn as you go. So they started with them, and then you start to bring it in with employees over time, right? And I'm not an expert on the change piece and driving that through, but I think the number is around, I think it's around 24, 26%. Greg Sittel writes about this a lot of getting that core of people that are believers, and then getting them to help expand it over time. So where in the past, I would have been all about, let's do this big thing and make a big splash. Now I'm more about experimentation and piloting and learning, rapidly learning, and then bringing people along and building over time.
Sounds like you can flesh out your messaging and your story and get people more engaged that way as well. So my next question for you is pretty straightforward. I think Claudio and I spend the majority of our time in the startup world, and we're always trying to help these CEOs get their narratives in a form that is persuasive, compelling, memorable, and gives their audience, whether it's investors, customers, or whomever, a reason to take a step in their direction, to find out more. So my question to you is, what is a key piece of advice or coaching that you can offer to these CEOs that are trying to communicate their business opportunity using a story? However, that story normally stops after the problem
Yep.
statement. And then they go feature, solution, go to market, blah, 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 blah. Talk to us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. So the inputs piece, I think, is the biggest key. And so I think we do a disservice, one, like I said before, when we say not everyone's a storyteller. But then on the other side, we tell everyone, tell a story, and you hear that over and over again. And you hear, you need to learn this specific framework, and it becomes a very mechanical exercise, right? And especially when you have technical founders, it could be like telling an English major, hey, go build a CAD design of a bridge. Right? They're just gonna, buy CAD and sit there and stare at it for hours. Like, what are they gonna do, right? And I think that can often happen. Is like, how do I tell a story? How do I start this thing? Even if you see, the structure of the hero's journey or whatever it is, right? And so for what I define atomic stories as is they are these small but powerful recollections of experiences that come from our customers, that come from our employees, that come from our partners, that have the energy and matter that's necessary to shift the future, right? So I'll give you an example or a couple examples. Friend of mine, years ago, I believe he had a family member who had died, or whose heart had stopped and had been saved by a defibrillator. And we'll just say it was Medtronic Physio Control was the brand, I believe it was. So he says, if you were to go to Physio Control's website, there are stories there, but you'll also hear about, potentially hear about things like, save people's lives in the moment, increase the safety of your workplace, et cetera, right? Or if he was coming in to pitch a defibrillator, for example, the story he could tell was what happened to him, which is, okay, this family member nearly lost their life. Because of that, he went and decided to raise money to put defibrillators in every school in the entire community. So he rallies the community, raises money, gets it done. Years later, he's at a restaurant or a coffee shop. Some guy walks in, sits down next to him, has a tattoo. And he says to the guy, hey, that's a really fascinating tattoo. Can you tell me the story? And it's a lightning bolt. And the guy said, yeah, years ago, when I was in high school, my heart stopped one day and there was a defibrillator there. Someone pulled it off the wall and saved my life because of it. My friend had placed that exact defibrillator, had raised the money for it, right? That's night and day difference, right? Like, you're not going to get that story every day. I'm not saying that. They've oftentimes they're just little small shifts, right? But it's starting with your audience, right? So I had a narrative that I built for a waste to energy startup this year, built the narrative, built the pitch deck, and there was an atomic story that we built into that. And what was interesting is one of the things that I advised them, and you can't always do this, but why are we creating this pitch in a vacuum? There are people who are part of the decision-making committee that you actually have access to. Go and ask them what will resonate. Go and ask them what they want to hear. But going and finding stories, and again, not that kind of story, but just go have conversations with the people in your audience, and you'll be shocked at the kinds of things that you learn. And they could be small, right? But it's those kinds of moments that start. And then it's really saying, okay, if these stories are the fuel, and then the narrative is not starting with my product. They don't care about you, right? It's what is the future, understanding what is the future that they, as the VC or eventually the buying committee, et cetera, what's the future that they want? And then what's the future that you want? and then what are the steps or the ways that you can get there, right? There's obviously a place to talk. Absolutely, you have to talk about the technology, right? But it's really starting with that journey to the future and creating a gap. Made to Stick is a phenomenal book from years back. I highly recommend, but it's about creating that gap between your audience and the future and how you can get there and bringing them along on that. But the number one thing I would say is start with the story, go and talk to people and just learn from them and use that as fuel for your narrative.
Great advice. So while I ask you your next question, I want to invite our audience to please take advantage of Chris here and ask. I'd like to challenge you. What is your biggest struggle or challenge with your storytelling? Let's ask Chris. Maybe he can give you a bit of help here today. This doesn't only have to be a one-way conversation. So while we wait for some of those questions to come in, Chris, I'd like you to please tell us, how do you see storytelling evolving in business based on AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would actually go to question the narratives that are shaping how we're approaching storytelling, right? So if you look at the narrative that's mostly believed, if you look at your timeline on LinkedIn or on Twitter, it appears like AI was just invented this year, right? And so all of a sudden it's like, oh, the savior of the world is here, right? And I think what, it can be a helpful tool, and I use it some. I've had some small successes, not major ones, but I think I see kind of two camps. I see people who are focused on building great technology, building great companies, and AI is a tool to help us get there, versus that kind of AI is the savior of the world piece, right? And so I think when you have that underlying narrative and you have that mentality, you're then looking at that as this is what's going to drive everything. And I think if you look at this, I was going to say current moment, but the current last 3 years, I think there's this elevated hunger and desire to connect with humans. And, I'm not saying AI can't or in the future won't tell a compelling story, but I guarantee you that it cannot create true, real moments that happen when you're out in the world connecting with actual humans, right? And so, yes, I think it's a great tool to help us with refining our thinking, to help us take away busy work that we shouldn't be spending our time on. But in my mind, the most important thing you can do in this age is go and meet people and talk to people, introduce yourself to strangers on planes and coffee shops and ask them their story. That's what I do. And I'm weird, but I think that's the most important thing you can do. And then use it as a tool to amplify the human story.
I love that. I love that. And in the meantime, while you were talking, Chris, Yash had a question, and he wants to know, how do you read the room before telling your story? And I think that's a very valid question, because you don't want to talk to the wrong people or to people that are in the wrong frame of mind.
Yeah, so I think part of it is we sometimes think about, when you're in a room, we think, hey, I have to be talking the entire time. And you have these preconceived notions around what the room is expecting, right? And obviously, if you're going to a pitch, you know what you need to deliver, right? But I think and again, there may be audiences that don't respond well to this, right? Obviously, first going into the room, wanting to know who's in the room and know what you can about them, right? Potentially, if possible, consume their content, see what their personality, how they present, what they care about, right? So for example, there was a startup leader that I met with this week who has a predictive AI platform. he cares about his technology, but he cares a whole lot more about how it can actually be, and I hate this buzzword, but I'm just going to use it. Okay, I was going to say democratized. That's a terrible word, so I'll say made accessible to people without the means for it, right? That's what he cares about. So I think doing that pre-work is super important. But I think there are also ways that you don't just throw your narrative at people, or don't just tell them a story. You can invite them into it and invite their input and make them a part of it, right? And I think in doing that, you're also giving them opportunities to engage, because facial expressions and body language are just one part of communication, right? So if there's ways you can get them to start to speak, I think hopefully those are some helpful tips.
Oh, for sure. Nathan, over to you.
Yes, sir. Okay, Chris, what's a common storytelling mistake that leaders make?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the most common one is making it about themselves.
Okay.
And versus the audience. And again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I think that's where it's, I can tell you some very compelling stories about me, and that has a place. But when I'm in the room and when I'm pitching, it's how do you make it about your audience? So I think that's a big one. And I think nerves can definitely drive that, right? As soon as you're nervous, what do you go back to? It's how do I, what's the thing I feel safe doing or not freaked out about? Is just talking about my product, right? So I think it's that piece of always keeping it about the audience. And I think another thing that's been helpful for me is, and this is one I've used with my podcast, is it's easy to go to that place of, I need this specific outcome coming out of this, and therefore I'm going to drive, and everything I'm going to do is driving to that outcome, versus a metaphor a coach gave me once is the lighthouse metaphor of when you're in your zone and doing the thing that you're wired to do that attracts people, versus the freaked out place of, I've got to drive and get to that finish line, right? And so I think that place of recognizing when you go into the room of serving people, and it could be this may sound really woo-woo, but it's not just about the story of these stories you're going to tell in this narrative about your product. It's also about the stories that people have within the room, and the narratives that they're carrying with them about you, about their day, about their family, a sick family member or a financial challenge with the company, right? And so recognizing at a meta level, you actually have an opportunity to come in and serve people and make their day better. And so recognizing that's going on as well. It's not just about the narrative that's in your deck.
Mm-hmm. Now, Chris, I wrote a book, The Founder's Guide to Presenting, and the first sentence in that book is, the role of emotions cannot be understated or overstated, yep. Right? When you work with heavyweights like Microsoft, how much do you think and talk about the emotions of the recipient of the story, and how do you impact and influence that on purpose?
Yeah, I think it was Antonio Damasio. I think he was at MIT, or is at MIT, and he talks about that we're not, what does he say? We're not thinking beings who have emotions. We're emotional beings who think. And I think it's something like upwards of 90% of a buy decision, at least on B2C purchases, is based on emotion, right? I think that one of the challenges that the big companies are largely responsible for is this idea that only focus on the rational and squeeze out the emotional because that's professional, right? And that's what people expect, which is a huge mistake. So what I do, whether I'm doing messaging, content, narrative, it's, again, going and gathering those atomic stories and bringing them in. And what I find is a very helpful exercise, whether it makes it into whatever you're creating or not, is writing a scenario based on something that actually happened and creating it within the content, right? So, for example, we did a project, I think it was 2 years back, for Microsoft 365. And if you looked at the messaging strategy, it's, what they wanted to communicate is communication, collaboration, scale, security, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you look at the brief, you look at the messaging, and it's just milk toast. There's nothing to work with there, right? So on the one hand, you could, as an agency, go and create that. But what we did is went and talked to humans, right? And it was a frustrating process at first, but eventually through a Microsoft partner, we stumbled on a customer who had this unbelievable story. So they were a Wall Street firm that trained veterans and combat wounded veterans to work on Wall Street with no background or degree in finance. They switched to Microsoft 365 and started using Teams the first week that everyone had to work from home during COVID. That Friday, and you have a lot of people that have worked in that industry for decades and are used to using physical phones. You have a number of people that are like that. Friday hits and they have a multi-billion-dollar deal come through that normally comes in at 8 a.m. and they have to have that debt sold by, and it usually closes by 8:30 in the evening. And there are a lot of things that break along the way. Using Microsoft Teams, they had one little hiccup and it was closed by 4 or 4:30. Like, that's cool. But then you see also that there's a veteran who's working on Wall Street from his hospital bed, recovering from his war wounds using Microsoft Teams, right? Again, not that you're always going to follow that, but what we ended up doing, it was a consideration piece. So in a consideration piece, you're always saying, here's our product, here's why it's valuable. Our senior copywriter writes sci-fi novels with half of her time. So we're like, we're going to write this as young adult literature. And thankfully we had a client that went for it. But the very first line was, we'll just say his name was Daniel, because I'm blanking on his name. But Daniel stared at the server. The server blinked back at him. That's literally the opening line to it, right? So we don't talk about Microsoft first. We talk about the story, pull people into the story, and then talk about that transition from this crazy server with wires sticking everywhere to this kind of journey to this future with Microsoft. So yeah, absolutely, I run into that, and it's just constant reminder to them and landing it in a scenario. And if you can't get that, then try to, look at videos, other things, and write a scenario just for yourself so that you can get into the mind and emotions of the customer. And bottom line, almost everyone's driven either by fear or pride. So that's
Yes.
pretty simple.
Fear or pride. Excellent, excellent. So we're nearly out of time here, Chris, but I know we have a couple of minutes to do a few more questions. And controversy is the topic here for me at the moment. I'd like you to be, if you need to be, a little controversial to this answer. Is there any popular storytelling advice that you disagree with? And if so, why?
Actually, I have some bullet points here. Contrary takes. I haven't really been using my notes, but so the first one is you're not going to create the story, most likely, and it's not going to come from inside the four walls of your building. So that's the first one. The second one that goes with that is your brand doesn't have the answers and your agency doesn't, right? So you constantly hear, well, it's all about having a better briefing process. It's all about having a better agency. And absolutely those things are important. But the most important thing is, I think it's Steve Case, but get outside the four walls of the building. And then the big one is the big pet peeve, controversial take is really around the hero's journey. There's a lot of people that use it as a framework, and it can be really helpful for people. For me personally, I think I use frameworks and they can be helpful, but again, I think it can create that, English major, go design a bridge. And it can also, cavemen weren't sitting in the cave and saying, oh, I wish Joseph Campbell would come along and tell us about create a framework for us so that we could tell a story, but in the meantime, we're just going to sit around the fire, right? Like, we all know how to tell stories. We've been telling stories for forever. So let's honor that and go and find them and recognize that everyone can tell a story versus trying to shove it in a framework.
Yeah, that's amazing. You know, all of the lean startup methodology in the startup world tells you to get out of the building and go meet with your customers or potential customers before you even lay a line of code or even do a prototype. So what you're talking about here is resonating with me, and I hope with the audience as well, that you need to do the same thing with your stories. Not just the story you use for the narrative of your company, but for every story that you share out there, because they're all in the customers and potential customers' heads, right?
Yeah, one of my favorite stories on this was he was a director at the time when I worked at Amazon Marketplace. He went on to become the VP, and I interviewed him for the podcast. And one of the things, from a narrative standpoint that everyone says, but especially Amazon says, is, oh, we're data driven, right? Well, the thing is like, you only have data on what's happened in the past, right? And so what the insights from the data told Amazon is that our entire business and the future of our business is resellers. So that's it, right? So they're banking on that for their future. But what's interesting is Pete, who was this leader there, started because of his commitment to go and talk to the audience. So I think he would occasionally act as an account manager so that he was learning from customers. But he went on a trip to New York and to Brooklyn and met these families, these multi-generation family-owned businesses. So it might be an immigrant family who's opened a vacuum cleaner store, back in the 40s. And today, their kids or grandkids are now, inventing consumables, so vacuum cleaner bags or other products and things like that, and they're selling them as their own brands, right? And so what he discovered is there's this whole new thing that they weren't looking at because that wasn't in the data. And now if you look at the percentage of what brand owners make up on Amazon's marketplace, now they're, I don't know remember the number, but it's like $220 billion business. And these brands make up a massive portion of it, right? But you never would have seen that if you didn't get out there and get outside the walls.
Mute. You are muted, Nathan.
I'm sorry. I'm so curious to hear from you, Chris. One more thing. What would you say is the most unique way you've seen companies get their new narrative installed into the brains of their employees? I know we touched on it earlier, but is there something unique that you saw anybody do that you could share with us?
So Outreach in the past, when I worked with them, this wasn't my doing. Gong has, I think, done a good job as well as, and again, this isn't necessarily, oftentimes, especially when I'm working with a really large company, I'm not able to see how it gets, how the uptake happens over time or being able to influence that. But I think what I've seen some of these companies do well is really train their employees and set up systems and processes so that when there is an announcement or when there's a story that ladders up to their narrative, that everyone is a part of it and making it their own and sharing it with the world, right? Like, worked on a campaign with Outreach a few years back, and it was the happiest timeline I've ever seen, to just scroll through and see every employee making it their own and seeing what we had created through working with them that was based on actual experiences in these atomic stories, and then seeing them share it out, right? I'm starting to get into, working with clients who are further, probably more mid-market, and am in the new year having opportunities. Looks like I'll have opportunities to start to work more on that, of where I'm shifting to is rapid experimentation, but also creating opportunities for the employees to not only tell their stories. I always do it as part of creating the narrative whenever possible, but also allowing them to tell their stories ongoing, so that they're feeling very much a part of shaping the narrative with leadership, and so those stories start to circulate and build. But again, that's experimentation, so we'll see how that pans out.
Very cool. Chris, I notice you are drinking from two different cups. Is it cold and warm, or sweet and sour, or what's the combination there?
One's the mug is water, and then the other one is electrolytes.
Whiskey. Ah,
Yeah.
okay. Not whiskey, vodka, or anything like
No.
that. No. Okay.
No.
Okay.
Nothing that exciting.
Well, Chris, you have been such a delightful guest here. It's wonderful to end our year with you as our special guest. And I would like to ask you, because it's Christmas time, it's the time of love and peace and giving gifts. So I would like to ask you, what is one of the more memorable presents that you have ever received, and what made it so memorable?
That's a great question. It was not the He-Man watch and the $5 bill that my grandfather gave me, so it's not that. We weren't even allowed to watch He-Man, so I would say it was so. It actually happened to me. This is my favorite example of both a gift and an atomic story. So this is maybe a bit difficult for some folks to hear, but in 2015, I was working at Amazon, and very toxic environment, and ended up nearly taking my life. I had things going into it, but that ended up happening. And eventually I went to work at Microsoft, and had a manager, the best manager I'd ever had, and he had a tattoo, a Pearl Jam tattoo on his arm. And I had never liked Pearl Jam. So this is 2015. I tried listening to them in the 90s, couldn't stand their music, and moved to Seattle, and like, I need to try, but I could not stand their music, could not get into it. And so he tells me this story about how in the 90s he was driving across Michigan, and he got a call, or maybe a page from his mom, and called and found out that his dad had just died. And on the radio, he was listening to, I believe it was playing at the time, but the song Alive by Pearl Jam, or he had it on disc. And so the whole drive home, he's listening to the song Alive by Pearl Jam, and tears just streaming down his face. So he tells me this story. So I thought, okay, well, I need to go listen to the song. And I listened to it, and it just, something shifted in me. So it's his story that caused me to go and listen to it, that inspired me to go and listen to it. And then it stuck for me, and it became an anthem for me. And I remember driving down the road singing it at the top of my lungs, like, yes, I am still alive, and I'm celebrating that, right? So fast forward, that's maybe 2015. A few weeks back, I post on LinkedIn this interview with Eddie Vedder, where he actually, the lead singer of Pearl Jam, where he actually talks about the fact that that song had nothing to do with what the fans interpreted it as. And it was actually, he found out, I believe, that his father his person he thought his father wasn't actually his father. And so it was a kind of an FU song, right? But that was a curse that he said had hung over his life. But when he heard how his fans interpreted it, that completely rewrote his narrative. So I posted that a few weeks back. My daughter and I, a week after that, and her friend, we go to the record store in Seattle. We go shopping for records. We have this challenge: see who can find a record for under $10. No one finds one. We fail. We leave the store. And I said, wait a second, I need to go back in. I forgot something. So you all go to the bakery. I go back in. I was going to get a Jason Isbell album. I walk upstairs, and Eddie Vedder is standing right there, digging through vinyl, looking for an album. And so I thought, I need to go up and tell him this story. And I thought, no, I'm not going to do that. He just wants to be a normal human. And I thought, maybe it's not him. And then I heard him talking. I'm like, yeah, it's definitely him. So I just went up to him and said, I thanked him for his song. And, he thanked me and shook my hand. And I said, actually, I need to tell you a story. And I led with, don't be offended, but I never liked your music. But what I said, I told him the story of how I'd nearly taken my life, and how this song had become an anthem for me. and he just stopped and just gave me this big hug and thanked me. And it was this moment, the explosive joy for me that lasted. I mean, I feel it in my body right now. Like, it lasted a long time, right? But that gift of that hug, like, that was one of the greatest gifts for me.
Wow. I mean, you are the man. You are a mensch. The way you tell this story, I had goosebumps while you were telling the story, and that's really a testament to your ability to weave the right narratives and the right stories at the right time. And yes, what a gift that must have been. Thank you so much for sharing this, Chris. And thank you for being here today. We have reached the end of our episode here. We have reached the end of actually PitchZone in its current format. We are going to take a break for a week. We'll be back on January the 4th, I believe. January the 4th in a new format, new look. You hopefully will like what we've been cooking up here. And with that, I thank you all for watching us live as well as on replay. Thank you, Chris. And of course, thank you, Nathan. And I wish you both and all of us watching a wonderful Christmas and a super happy New Year. Make the New Year the best one yet. And with that, I wish you a wonderful morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world. And we shall see each other again next week. No, next year. See you. Bye-bye.